Hello everyone. Our topic of discussion is spinal traction. In physiotherapy, traction can be defined as drawing tension applied to a body segment. In a clinic, in a physiotherapy setup, the traction can be applied either mechanically or manually. When we use mechanical traction, we use traction equipment or ropes and pulley setup with which we can apply traction usually in the spine. It may be performed manually where a therapist knows the proper biomechanics and uses appropriate body positions in which the traction force is applied to a certain body segment. Before discussing traction techniques in detail, let us first discuss the physical effects of traction. The traction has effects on spinal movement, it has effects on bone, ligaments, the intervertebral disc, the articular facet joints. It also has the effects on the muscular system and the nerves passing through the spinal column. Traction to the spine encourages the movement of the spine in both the way there is overall movement of the spine as well as each individual spinal segment. Here you can see in the diagram, in diagram A, in the usual anti-gravity upright position, there is a compressive force coming on the spine, and in that case the distance between the two vertebral bodies is less, whereas when the traction is applied as shown in figure B and the traction force is presented with an upward arrow, you can see that the intervertebral distance has increased, and you can also see there is somewhat separation of the articular facet joints. So this shows that traction force will enhance the total length of the spinal column as such, and along with that there is a micro movement occurring between the individual intervertebral joints. The same diagram is enlarged and put in the slide. So you can see on the left side the spinal column under the normal compressive effect, and on the right side the spinal column under the effect of traction. You can also see a slightly yellow shaded intervertebral foramen where the size of the intervertebral foramen on the right side under the effect of traction is increased. To the extent the spine moves under the effect of traction, it depends upon 3 points. One is the position of spine, whether the spine is in flexion or extension or rotation or in side flexion. It also depends on the amount of force, that the traction force has to be beyond a certain threshold level, then only it will produce its effects. And third thing is the length of time for which the force is applied, as some of the tissues in the spinal column has viscoelastic properties. They also respond in a time bound manner, so with prolonged time they show a better response under the effect of traction force. Some researches on spinal traction have reported separations of about 1 to 2 mm per intervertebral segment. But these changes are transient, and the spine quickly returns to the previous intervertebral space relationship when the traction force is released and the erect posture is assumed. One such research was performed by John Matthews in 1968, and he published original research paper titled as Dynamic Discography, a study of lumbar traction in Annals of Physical Medicine. He injected contrast dye in the intervertebral disc space in some of his patients and took the X-ray before traction, during traction and after traction. And one of such sample of X-ray is shown here. So A, B, C and D are 4 X-rays. A is before traction, B is in the initial part of traction, C is at the end of traction and D is after certain minutes of traction. So although we are not able to see the clear-cut differences, the A and C images and their diagrammatic presentation is overlapped into the diagram shown below. And as you can see that the lower lumbar vertebrae, when they are kept at the same level, the upper lumbar vertebrae are actually showing some difference. So the dotted line is the image C and the straight continuous line is image A. So there is a progressive increase in the intervertebral space, and in his research he found that the maximum increase in intervertebral space at individual level is 1 to 2 millimeters. In some of the spinal conditions, the symptoms may be present because of impingement or irritation of the nerve roots when they are exiting from the intervertebral foramina, and these are the quite sensitive areas. Even a slight irritation will produce symptoms like pain or paresthesia or tingling. So when the traction is applied and under the effect of traction, there is a physical separation of intervertebral segments, and there may be reduction of pressure on the sensitive structures, and patient may present the feeling of reduction in these symptoms of pain and paresthesia. So if these symptoms are relieved during the effect of traction, the prognosis for the patient is good, and the traction should be continued as a part of the treatment plan. Whenever any mechanical load is applied to any tissues of the body, the tissues adapt to that mechanical load, whether it may be traction or compression or shear or any other type of force. And this phenomenon has been described as Wolff's law. So even the bones follow the same principle. So this, according to Wolff's law, bone changes usually occur in response to compressive or the destructive loads, and when we are using the spinal traction, the traction has a destructive load. So the traction places a destructive load on each of the vertebrae which are affected or are having the influence of traction force. And although bone tissue adapts relatively quickly, the bony changes do not occur fast enough to cause the symptom changes that occur with the traction application. That means that under the influence of traction, we do not expect that there will be any sudden improvement like in the form of radiological changes in the bones. But an intermittent traction with a rhythmic on and off load cycle, it provides distraction load and also promotes the movement of the vertebral bodies in relation to each other. The major effect of traction on the bone may come from the increase in the spinal movement that reverses any immobilization related bone weakness by increasing or maintaining the bone density. So ultimately, whichever part of the vertebral body comes under the influence of distraction force, the bone density increases in that part, and because the distraction relieves some symptoms, the bony movement also increases at the intervertebral joint levels. So this intervertebral joint movement increase will also follow the Wolff's law and will help into further bony adaptations to the movement forces. The ligaments have viscoelastic properties that allow them to adapt slowly in response to mechanical loads and to return to their original form after removal of the deforming load. With rapid loading, the ligaments become stiff and they resist the deforming force. So slow loading allows the ligaments to lengthen slowly with minimum risk of injury. If any ligaments are shortened or contracted after injury, or they have undergone adaptive shortening, slow loading traction may help to restore their original length. As the ligaments contain proprioceptive receptors, when they undergo intermittent loading and traction force, the proprioceptors are stimulated, and this may help to reduce the pain arising from that area through pain gate mechanism similar to that obtained with TENS. Traction does have an effect on disc protrusions and disc related pain. We will learn this through the diagrammatic presentation. So here first let us see the normal disc. So here it is the normal disc with vertebral body above and below. In the center we have nucleus pulposus, on the outside we have annulus fibrosus. The arrows indicate pressure inside the nucleus pulposus which is exerted on the outer side to the layers of annulus fibrosus as well as to the vertebral bodies above and below. And because the annulus fibrosus is intact, the pressure is exerted equally on either direction. If the disc is partially injured, that is, there is slight tear in the annulus fibrosus, whenever the person assumes a weight-bearing position, that is sitting or standing, there will be compressive force to the intervertebral disc due to the effect of gravity. So the upper vertebrae and upper body weight will give compression effect, and that's why the disc flattens. So there is reduced disc space and the two vertebral bodies become slightly adjacent to each other. So with this flat disc, the height of the disc is decreased and the side to side expansion of the disc is increased because the annulus fibrosus is now less efficient to contain the disc material inside it. Whenever any movement occurs in the spine, that is flexion or extension or side flexion to either side, there is abnormal pressure distribution to the intervertebral disc. So say here in this diagram, there is the movement of flexion, and with flexion there is anterior compressive force, and in the posterior part the compressive force is less, rather it is slightly destructive force. So the nucleus, which is having the fluid-like property, it adapts itself to this compressive and destructive forces. So with forward compression, the nucleus is in the less extent in the anterior part, whereas it is trying to push the posterior fibers of annulus fibrosus and the posterior longitudinal ligament further backwards. And if the disc material and the anatomy is healthy, that is non-injured, it will just press the annulus fibrosus and posterior longitudinal ligament posteriorly, but it will not damage it. If the annulus fibrosus is partially damaged, there may be slight bulge of annulus fibrosus and posterior longitudinal ligament to the posterior part, that is somewhere within the spinal canal. So here we can see that the posterior part of annulus fibrosus is partially damaged. So when the person bends forwards with this type of micro injury to the annulus fibrosus, the nucleus pulposus is pushed. But because it is not in a healthy condition and there is some gap between the layers of annulus fibrosus, the nucleus pulposus is pushed to those layers and assumes or takes over some space between the layers of annulus fibrosus. If it is more damaged, it takes a space between the annulus fibrosus and the posterior longitudinal ligament. So it makes a pouch and a strong protrusion. If it is in the exact posterior position of the disc, then it may have little bit or no compression, or if the compression is there, it may be in the anterior part of the spinal cord. However, if the protrusion is not exactly posterior but posterolateral, it might be somewhere around the intervertebral foramen. That is the area from which the spinal nerves come out or exit. So these spinal nerves or nerve roots may come into partial or complete contact of this protrusion, and they may undergo some amount of compression, and which may affect the healthy functioning of these nerve roots. That may be the reason why the person may develop symptoms like paresthesia as well as the symptoms like muscle weakness. Under the effect of traction force to the intervertebral segment, the traction force will try to pull the vertebral bodies apart from each other, and because they are connected through the medium of vertebral disc, so the connection of annulus fibrosus, which is through one end of the vertebral body to the other end, that also undergoes tension, and this results into tightening of the annulus fibrosus bands in such a way that they are taut into the superior inferior direction, and they try to assume their shortest position, and they are aligned in the vertical alignment of the spine. So this tension produced in the annulus fibrosus will push the nucleus pulposus back into the center, because even the anterior bands of the annulus fibrosus are taut, as well as the posterior bands are also taut, as well as the lateral bands are also taut. So from all directions, the nucleus pulposus is pushed towards the center. And even if the annulus fibrosus is partially damaged, this type of traction force will produce sufficient tension in the annulus fibrosus to push the nucleus pulposus within the center. That is one of the positive benefits. If the traction force is sufficient enough, it may be able to pull the nucleus pulposus to its normal position. Traction force may affect joint surfaces and cause mild separation of articular surfaces, meniscoid structures, or other loose bodies. If they are entrapped in these joints, they may be released under the effect of traction and result into dramatic reduction of painful symptoms. Improved joint separation will decompress articular cartilage of facet joints, and this will allow movement of synovial fluid in the joints. This synovial fluid is necessary for nutrition of articular cartilage and may help to delay the degenerative changes of these joints. Movement produced between articular surfaces of facet joints will also stimulate proprioceptors, and this may also help into decreased pain perception through pain gate mechanism. Vertebral muscles are effectively stretched by the traction force. The body position provides initial stretch force, which is followed by the additional stretching, which is due to the traction force. Electromyographic recording of the erector spinae muscles during traction shows some reduction in EMG activity, which suggests that these muscles are less contracting, which is indirectly a sign of mild relaxation of these muscles. Same thing may also be confirmed by palpation of these muscles during traction. And if the patient learns active muscle relaxation, it may also be added along with the traction therapy. Tight muscles may undergo lengthening, allowing the better mobility of the spine. Nerves are the most common target of all traction therapies. Pressure on the nerve roots produced by disc bulge, facet joint irritation, bony spurs, or narrowed intervertebral foramen causes spinal pain and other neurological symptoms. Paresthesias are most common in nerve root compression. Continuous unrelieved pressure on the nerve root may lead to nerve root dysfunction, resulting into weakness and numbness to the motor and sensory areas supplied by that nerve root. In such a case, traction is often helpful, relieving pressure over it and re-establishing its blood circulation and nutrition so that the nerve root may return to its normal conduction activity. Normal spinal mechanics allow movements to occur that narrow or enlarge the intervertebral foramina. If the patient is placed in the supine position with hips and knees flexed, the lumbar spine bends forwards and spinous processes separate. This movement increases the size of intervertebral foramen bilaterally. The flex postures used to treat low back pain are examples of this positional traction. Previous technique was for bilateral intervertebral foramen opening. This technique is for unilateral foramen opening. So the greatest unilateral intervertebral foramen opening occurs by positioning the patient in side lying with a pillow or blanket roll between the iliac crest and the lower border of the rib cage. The side on which increased foramen opening is desired should be superior. The roll should be close to the level of the spine, where the traction separation is desired. The spine side bends around the roll. The patient's hips and knees are then flexed until the lumbar spine is in a forward bend position. This accentuates the opening of the foramen. Maximal opening can be achieved by adding trunk rotation towards the side of the superior shoulder. Positional traction is normally used when the patient is on a very restricted activity program because of low back pain. The positions are used on a trial and error basis to determine maximum comfort and to attempt to relieve pressure on the nerve roots. The results of the patient evaluation should be used to determine whether the painful side should be up or down when using the side-lying positional traction technique. Protective scoliosis is the most obvious sign that will help determine the patient position. If the patient leans away from the painful side should be up, and if the patient leans towards the painful side should be down. Inversion traction is another positional traction which is used for prevention and treatment of back problems. Specialized equipments or simply hanging upside down from a chinning bar places a person in inverted position. The spinal column is lengthened because of the stretch provided by the weight of the trunk. The force of the trunk in this position is usually calculated to be approximately 40% of body weight. When the person is comfortable and able to relax, the length of the spinal column increases, and this length changes coincide with decrease in the spinal muscle activity. If the patient is comfortable in completely inverted position, 70 seconds may be used as a minimum treatment time. The inverted position may be repeated 2 or 3 times at a treatment session with a 2 to 3 minute rest between the bouts. Longer treatment times may also enhance the results, and maximum treatment times range from 10 to 30 minutes. Blood pressure should be monitored while the patient is in this inverted position. If a rise of 20 mm of mercury above the resting diastolic pressure is found, the therapist should stop the treatment for that session. Contraindications include hypertensive individuals and anyone with heart disease or glaucoma, patients with sinus problems, diabetes, thyroid conditions, asthma, migraine headaches, detached retinas, or hiatal hernias should consult their physicians before the treatment is initiated. Patients who have undergone recent surgery or are having musculoskeletal problems in hips or knee joints who might not be able to adapt in this inversion traction apparatus, and they may require some modification of this apparatus. Because it is an inverted position, meals or snacks should not be eaten during the hour before the treatment to keep the patient comfortable. One method of testing the patient's tolerance to the inverted position is to have the patient assume the hand-knee position and put his or her head on the floor, holding that position for 60 seconds. Any vertigo, dizziness, or nausea may indicate that this patient is a poor candidate for inversion and that the treatment progression should be very slow. Manual lumbar traction is used for lumbar spine problems to test the patient's tolerance to traction, to arrive at the most comfortable treatment setup, to make the traction as specific to one vertebral level as possible, and to make the specificity needed for a traction mobilization of the spine. If the patient's back pain is diminished by having the therapist flex the patient's hips and knees to 90 degrees and apply enough pressure under the calves to lift the buttocks off the table, then the patient is a good candidate for spine 90 degree traction. The disadvantage is that maintaining the large forces necessary for separation of lumbar vertebrae for a period of time is difficult and energy consuming for the therapist. Having split table will eliminate most of the friction between the patient's body segments and the treatment table, and it is essential for effective delivery of manual lumbar traction. The therapist's effort does not cause separation of the vertebral segments unless the frictional forces are overcome first. To make the traction specific to a vertebral level, the patient is positioned in sideline on the split table. For traction specific to L34, L45, and L5S1 levels, the patient's lumbar spine is flexed using the patient's upper leg as a lever. The therapist palpates the interspinous area between the two spinous processes. The upper spinous process is the one at which maximum effect is desired. When the lumbar spine flexes and the therapist feels the motion of the lower spinous process with the palpating hand, the foot is placed against the opposite leg so that further flexion is not allowed. The patient's trunk is rotated by the therapist until motion of the upper spinous process is felt by the therapist. Trunk rotation should be passively produced by the therapist, positioning the patient's upper arm with hand on the rib cage and pulling on the patient's lower arm, creating trunk rotation towards the upper arm. In this case, it is rotation to the left. If lumbar levels T12, L1, L12 and L23 are to be given specific traction, the patient is again positioned sideline. These levels require positioning in reverse order from the lower levels. First, the trunk is rotated, then the lumbar spine is flexed. In both instances, the rotation and flexion tighten and lock joint structures in which these motions have taken place, leaving the desired segment with more movement available than the upper or lower levels. When traction is applied, greater movement of the desired level occurs, whereas movement at other levels is minimized because of the joint locking created by the preliminary positioning. The split table is then released and the therapist palpates the spinous processes of the selected intervertebral level, places his or her chest against the anterior superior iliac spine of the patient's upper hip and leans towards the patient's feet. Enough force is used to cause the palpable separation of the spinous processes. Intermittent movement is most easily accomplished, whereas sustained traction becomes physically more difficult. When using mechanical traction, the therapist will have to select and adjust the following 7 parameters of traction equipment and patient position. Body position may be prone, supine, or hip position, and direction of pull may be bilateral or unilateral. The amount of traction force used can be adjusted. If the traction mode is intermittent, traction time and rest time may be adjusted. Another selection of mode of traction is sustained traction. Total duration of treatment may be adjusted, and traction force may be having progressive increment or progressive decrement. So progressive steps and regressive steps may also be adjusted. A split table or other mechanisms to eliminate friction between body segments and the table surface is a prerequisite to effective lumbar traction. Otherwise, most of the force applied would be spent overcoming the coefficient of friction. A non-slip traction harness is needed to transfer the traction force very comfortably to the patient and to stabilize the trunk while the lumbar spine is placed under the traction. A harness lined with the vinyl material is best because it sticks to the patient's skin and does not slip like the other cotton-lined harnesses. Clothing between the harness and the skin will also promote slipping. The vinyl-sided harness does not have to be as constricting as the cotton-backed harness to prevent slippage, thus increasing the patient's comfort. The harness can be applied when the patient is standing next to the traction table prior to the treatment. The pelvic harness is applied so the contact pads and the upper belt are at or just above the level of the iliac crest. Shirts should never be tucked under the pelvic harness because some of the traction force would be dissipated pulling the shirt material. The contact pads should be adjusted so that the harness loops provide a posteriorly directed pull, encouraging the lumbar flexion. The harness firmly adheres to the patient's hips. The rib belt is then applied in a similar manner with the rib pads positioned over the lower rib cage in a comfortable manner. The rib belt is then snugged up and the patient is positioned on the table. The standing application of the traction harness is easier and more effective if the patient is to be placed in a prone position for treatment. The traction harness can also be applied by laying it down on the traction table and having the patient lie down on top of it. The pads are then adjusted and belts snugged and patient will be lying down then afterwards. Body position has been reported to have substantial impact on traction results, but this has been empirically derived rather than research supported. Generally, the neutral spinal position allows for the largest intervertebral foramen opening, and it is usually the position of choice, whether the patient is prone or supine. Extension beyond neutral lumbar spine causes the bony elements of the foramen to create a narrow opening. Lumbar spinal flexion beyond neutral causes the ligamentum flavum and other soft tissues to constrict the foramen opening. Saunders recommends the prone position with a normal to slightly flattened lumbar lordosis as the position of choice in disc protrusions. The amount of lordosis may be controlled by using the pillows under the abdomen. The prone position also allows the easy application of other modalities to the painful area and an easier assessment of the amount of spinous process separation. In a research done by John Reilly, where he tried to evaluate the effect of traction and the amount of intervertebral separation at different hip angles. So in this research, when the traction was applied to the patients in supine position, the hip position was found to affect the vertebral separation. As hip flexion increased from 0 to 90 degrees, the traction produced greater posterior intervertebral space separation. Unilateral pelvic traction also has been recommended when a stronger force is desired on one side of the spine. Patients with protective scoliosis, unilateral joint dysfunction, or unilateral lumbar spine spasm with scoliosis may do quite well with this approach. Only one side of the pelvic harness is hooked to the traction device to accomplish this technique. In patients with protective scoliosis, when the patient leans away from the painful side, the traction should be applied from the side with the muscle spasm. In unilateral facet joint dysfunction, the traction should be applied from the side of most complaint. Overall, patient positioning for traction should be varied according to a patient's need and comfort. Experimentation with positioning is encouraged so that the traction's effect on the patient will be maximized. Patient comfort is far more important than relative position in making patient position decisions. If the patient cannot relax, the traction will not be successful in causing vertebral separation. Several researchers have indicated that no lumbar vertebral separation will occur with traction forces less than 1/4 of the patient's body weight. The traction force necessary to cause effective vertebral separation will range between 65 and 200 pounds. This force does not have to be used on the first treatment, and progressive steps both during and between treatments are often necessary to comfortably reach these therapeutic loads. A force equal to half the patient's body weight is a good guideline to be used in selecting force high enough to cause vertebral separation. These high weight levels pose no danger, as cadaver research indicates that a force of 440 pounds or greater will be necessary to cause damage to the lumbar spine components. Caution must be used when using traction of the lumbar spine, because there is a tendency for the nucleus pulposus gel to imbibe fluid from the vertebral body and thus increasing the pressure within the disc. This happens in a very short period of time. When pressure is released and weight is applied to the disc, this excess fluid increases pressure on the annulus and exacerbates the patient's symptoms. Therefore, it is recommended that during an initial treatment with lumbar traction, a minimum of 30 pounds to be used to determine whether traction will have a negative effect on the symptoms. This comment on the 30-pound weight as an assessment for the lumbar spine traction was based on a review published by Harris in 1977. So actually the review is regarding the cervical spine, and although the textbook mentions that the 30 pounds should be used as a primary screening tool, it is more applicable to the cervical rather than the lumbar spine. Good results have been reported with both intermittent and sustained traction. In most cases of lumbar disc problems, sustained traction seems to be the treatment of choice. Partial reduction in disc protrusions was reported in 4 minutes of sustained traction.
Sustained traction is favored in treating intervertebral disc herniation because sustained traction allows more time with the disc uncompressed to cause the disc nuclear material to move centripetally and reduce the disc herniation's pressure on nerve structures. When used for this purpose, sustained traction may be superior to intermittent traction. In deciding on sustained versus intermittent traction, the therapist should follow the guidelines for treating diagnosed disc herniations with sustained traction, whereas most other traction appropriate diagnoses may be treated with intermittent traction. Intermittent traction in any case is usually more comfortable when using higher forces, and increased comfort is one of the primary considerations because there is no conclusive evidence supporting the choice of one method over the other. The total treatment times of sustained traction and intermittent traction are only partially research based. With sustained traction, Matthews found reduction in disc protrusion after 4 minutes, with further reduction in 20 minutes. Complete reduction in protrusions was seen at 38 minutes. Other researchers, however, in cervical spine studies, they found no difference in separation of the cervical spine when times of 7, 30 and 60 seconds were compared. When dealing with suspected disc protrusions, the total treatment time should be relatively short. As the disc space widens, the pressure inside the disc decreases and the disc nucleus moves centripetally. The projected time for pressure within a disc to equalize is 8 to 10 minutes. At this point, nuclear material is no longer moving centripetally. With longer time in this position, osmotic forces equalizes the pressure within the disc with that of the surrounding tissue. When the pressure equalization occurs, the traction effect on the protrusion is lost. The intradiscal pressure may increase when the traction is released if the traction stays on too long. This increased pressure results in increased symptoms. This situation has not been reported when treatment times are kept at 10 minutes or less. If this reaction does occur, shorter treatment times or long hold intermittent traction, that is 60-second traction and 10 to 20 seconds rest, may be necessary to control the symptoms. Some sources advocate the traction times of up to 30 minutes. The contradiction in this much differences, that is 10 minutes versus 30 minutes, may be because of the pathology of the individual anatomy of each patient. However, an adverse reaction to traction, that is dramatic increase in symptoms when the traction is released, is something the therapist should try to avoid. Total treatment time for sustained traction when treating disc related symptoms should start at less than 10 minutes. If the treatment is successful in reducing the symptoms, the time should be left at 10 minutes or less. If the treatment is partially successful or unsuccessful in relieving symptoms, the therapist may increase the time gradually over several treatments to up to 30 minutes. Some traction equipment is built with progressive and regressive modes. The machine progressively increases the traction force in a pre-selected number of steps. A gradual increase in pressure lets the patient accommodate to the traction and helps him or her to stay relaxed. A gradual progression of force also allows the therapist to release the split table after the slack in the system has been taken up by several progressions. The regressive steps do just the opposite and allow the patient to come down gradually from the high loads. Again, the patient comfort is primary consideration because no research supports any such protocol. Some equipment has the capability to be programmed for progressive and regressive steps and also to have minimum traction forces, allowing a sustained force with intermittent peaks. To achieve such traction setups with a machine that is not programmable, manual operation and timing are necessary. Throughout the discussion on lumbar traction, patient comfort comes up again and again in regard to the parameters of the treatment setup. One of the primary keys to successful traction treatment is the relaxation of the patient. The use of appropriate modalities before and during the traction treatment adds to the total effectiveness of the treatment plan. Bracing or appropriate exercise after traction may also enhance the results and prolong the benefits gained. Better technology and more research will help to refine the traction art and provide better results from this type of treatment. The objectives for using traction in the cervical region do not vary much from the objectives for using traction in the lumbar region. Reasonable objectives for cervical traction include stretch of the muscle and joint structures of the vertebral column, enlargement of the intervertebral spaces and foramina, centripetally directed forces on the disc and soft tissues around the disc, mobilizations of vertebral joints, increases and changes in joint proprioception, relief of compressive effects of normal posture, and improvement in arterial, venous, and lymphatic flow. In the clinical setting, diagnosis and symptoms requiring traction are found infrequently. These diagnoses are more typically found in older populations. The patient's head and neck are supported by the therapist. The hand should cradle the neck and provide adequate grip for the effective transfer of the traction force to the mustard process. One hand should be placed under the patient's neck with the thenar eminence in contact with one mustard process and fingers cradling the neck, reaching across towards the other mustard process. The therapist then provides a gentle pull in a cephalic direction. Intervertebral separation is not desired because of the damage to the ligaments or capsule. A head halter or similar harness may also be used to deliver the force. The force should be intermittent with the traction time between 3 and 10 seconds. The rest time may be very brief but the traction force should be released almost completely. The total treatment time should be between 3 and 10 minutes. When pain is limiting or affecting movement, a bout of traction should be followed by a reassessment of the painful motion to determine increase or decrease in pain or motion. Successive bouts of traction can be used as long as the symptoms are improving. When the symptoms stabilize or are worse on the reassessment, the traction should be discontinued. A variety of head and neck positions can be used in cervical traction. Different head and neck positions will place some vertebral structures under more tension than others. Good knowledge of cervical kinesiology and biomechanics and good knowledge and skill in joint mobilization, they are required before the therapist should experiment with extensive positional changes. At the completion of traction treatment, in cases of strain or sprain, protection of the neck with a soft collar is often desirable to prevent extremes of motion, minimize compressive forces, and encourage muscle relaxation. Instructions in sleeping positions and regular support postures are also important in caring for patients with cervical problems. The literature does provide a relatively clear protocol to use in trying to achieve vertebral separation using a mechanical traction apparatus. The patient should be supine or long sitting with the neck flexed between 20 and 30 degrees. A sitting posture can be used, but this is clinically more cumbersome and is not supported by the research as an optimal position of cervical traction. The traction harness must be arranged comfortably so that the majority of the pull is placed on the occiput rather than the chin. Some cervical traction harnesses do not have a chin piece. These harnesses may have an advantage provided that the traction force is effectively transferred to the structure of the cervical spine. A traction force about 20 pounds applied intermittently for a minimum of 7 seconds traction time and with adequate rest time for recovery is recommended. This traction should be continued over 20 to 25 minutes. Higher forces up to 50 pounds may produce increased separation, but the other parameters should remain the same. The average separation at the posterior vertebral area is 1 to 1.5 mm per space, while the anterior vertebral area separates approximately 0.5 mm per space. Greater separations are expected in the younger population than the older population. Within 20 to 25 minutes from the time traction is stopped and normal sitting or standing postures are assumed, the vertebral separation returns to its previous heights. The upper cervical segments do not separate as easily as lower cervical segments. The addition of pain reducing and heating modalities will add to the benefits gained by the traction.
There are a number of conditions for which spinal traction may be useful, including cases where there is impingement on a nerve root resulting from disc herniation, spondylolisthesis, narrowing within the intervertebral foramen, or osteophyte formation, degenerative joint diseases, subacute pain, joint hypermobility, discogenic pain, and muscle spasm. Traction, except as a light mobilization, is contraindicated in acute sprains or strains in the initial 3 to 5 days, acute inflammation, or in any conditions in which movement is either undesirable or exacerbates the existing problem. In case of vertebral joint instability, traction may perpetuate the instability or cause further strain. Certainly, the serious problems associated with tumors, bone diseases, osteoporosis, and infections in bones or joints are also contraindications. Patients who can potentially experience problems relating to the fitting of harness, such as those with vascular conditions, pregnant females, or those with cardiac or pulmonary problems, should also avoid traction. Traction has been used to treat a variety of cervical and lumbar spine problems. The effect of traction on each system involved in the complex anatomic makeup of the spine needs to be considered when selecting traction as a part of therapeutic treatment plan. The traction protocol should be set up to manage a particular problem rather than applied in the same manner regardless of the patient or pathology. Traction is a flexible modality with an infinite number of variations available. The flexibility allows the patient to adjust protocols to match the patient's symptoms and diagnosis. Traction is capable of producing separation of vertebral bodies, a centripetal force on the traction of the soft tissues surrounding the vertebrae, a mobilization of vertebral joints, a change in proprioceptive discharge of the spinal complex, a stretch of connective tissue, a stretch of muscle tissue, and improvement in arterial, venous, and lymphatic flow, and a lessening of the compressive effects on the posture. Any of these effects can change the symptoms of the patient under treatment and help to normalize the patient's lumbar or cervical spine.